It's my great pleasure to welcome this panel and to welcome you also for this panel on intersectionality. My job is a very easy one. It's to introduce Tomi Adeaga, who's going to chair this panel. Tomi is a professor at the University of Vienna, and she's a specialist in translation studies, women's studies, cultural studies, and we've had a long academic relationship because we were two of the earliest PhDs in African literary translation studies. So, Tomi, it's a great pleasure to invite you in your own part of the world, of Berlin. It's been a great joy to curate this panel and to have these wonderful people who are very keen on theorizing the intersectionality of issues and how they impact on languages. So it's my great pleasure also to welcome you individually. So I won't introduce you, and I'll hand that honor to Dr. Tomi Adeaga. Welcome, and welcome to our audience.
Thank you very much, Professor Wangũi Goro. It's also a great pleasure for me to be here to also moderate this panel, this roundtable, which is the easiest job today, and also at the same time to actually welcome our guest speakers and also to appreciate the huge work that they are actually doing to move the conversation and the field of translation from African languages and other languages that's got to do with
you can turn this off.
Africa and its people. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to also start this conversation by introducing the guest speakers. So Dr. Njeri Rahab is a PhD historian and activist committed to community and scholarship. Her research areas and academic interests are post-colonial and gender studies, intersectionality, Black feminism, Africana humanist, critical whiteness studies, Black diaspora, migration studies, and Canadian studies. She's a trainer in critical whiteness, anti-Black racism, and critical intersectional diversity. Dr. Njeri is a board member of the Health Committee of the City of Cologne, a board member of Post-Colonial Heritage of the City of Cologne, and the advisory board of ANSA, AFAO, DAAD, yes. She's a founder of the Kemet Awards for Achievement in African Languages, KAAL Awards. She's currently an advisor on racism critique and anti-discrimination policy and strategy development at the University of Cologne. It's a pleasure to welcome you in our midst today. And our next speaker is a Melody Makeda Ledwon, who is a bilingual translator and interpreter. She translates into German and English. Her work focuses on intersectional perspectives, critical of racism and approaches to Afro-diasporic history and literature, especially Black feminisms. Her translations include Entangled Histories, a conversation between Iman Atiyah and Michael Rothbeck, which was published by S. Fisher in 2018, and Kobahi River Collective, A Black Feminist Statement, which was published by UNRAST in 2019. She's also the translator of Angela Davis, an autobiography, which will be published by Aki Publishing House in October. Actually, sorry.
I wrote it before.
Okay, which was published, by Aki Publishing House in October this year. In autumn 2020, she launched the Network of Black Translators. It's a great honor to have you here with us today. And it's also a pleasure for me to introduce Simoné Goldschmidt Lechner, who is a writer, translator, and interdisciplinary artist. She's the author of the novel Knives, Tongues, which was published by Maths and Sites in 2022, and has also co-translated a number of academic and literary works into German and English. Her recent translations include Against White Feminism by Rafia Zakaria in 2022, Exposure by Olivia Sujic in 2023, The Patriarchs of Angela Saini in 2023, and Angela Y. Davis, an autobiography in 2023, which she co-published with Melody Makeda, Ledwon, and Miriam Nuning. She has recently collaborated on several theater and performance projects. Her bilingual novella Days, You'll Find Me in a Place I Like to Go, will be published in early 2024. So we have actually all these things explain the intersectionality in the work of each and every one of us. Yeah. And yes, I know you have you have introduced yourself, but I take the right of the moderator to introduce you again, for those of us who do not know you. So it is a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Wangũi Goro into our midst today, which is a great honor as well. And I would like to say that, I won't say it because I've known you for a long time. No. I'll just say that you have enjoyed an interdisciplinary life, spending over 40 years as a public intellectual and lecturing widely in many parts of the world. Professor Goro is a translator and translation theorist, writer, poet, scholar, cultural curator, and editor with a great passion for the potential of languages of translation, literature, and intersectional freedom. I like that. She is passionate about promoting African literary translation in different parts of the world, which she does through Africa in Translation, AIT, through Sidensi. She's a professor of translation at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and linked to King's College, London, and the University of Nairobi through the Wangũi Goro LSA Prize, which promotes creativity and translation of African languages. She's the founder of Trakala, the translation caucus of the African Literature Association. Her recent works, such as poems, for example, have appeared in several anthologies. She is known for her translations of writers such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Veronique Tajo's work as The Crow Flies from French, as well as other translations into and from African literatures. Actually, what she didn't mention here is that she's the translator of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Matigari from Gikuyu into English. And, and her works also include translations from French, Italian, Swahili, and Gikuyu. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. So, even just by reading everyone's short bio already, it also already reflects the intersectionality in each person's work. And so, because this roundtable, well, this podium discussion is on intersectionality and translating African languages. So I would just want to ask each of you how your works actually reflect, how they reflect intersectionality. In what way do you actually see your works as being intersectional in the various forms?
Should I start? Okay. So, hello everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. I am very glad to be here. I always like starting by acknowledging that I do not stand alone. I come with a lot of people behind me, all my ancestors behind me. I like acknowledging that because, connecting to your question, I work currently in an institution in the University of Cologne. I hold the first position ever in a German university where it's actually about anti-Rassismuskritik, so anti-racism laws and policies. And we have the first university in Germany to have a Beauftragte für Rassismuskritik, which is not Antidiskriminierung, but Rassismuskritik. And so I understand that I sit in a position that many women and men who look like me were never allowed to get into those spaces. And so not just because I am very smart, which I am, by the way, but also because these women and men did a lot of work in order for me to be in that position. So that's why I always like acknowledging and saying I come with all of them, because it's important to acknowledge, because when we acknowledge, we give them back, and we also have a kind of responsibility. So in terms of my work, what I do, everything that I do is intersectional, especially when it comes to institutions like the university. So when I'm looking at anti-discrimination laws and policies within the university, it also means I'm not only looking at race, I'm also looking at class, gender, and all the categories that are in there. And so for me, this is a daily thing. This is not something that I separate from the work that I do. It's also part of how I live. But also the initiative that you mentioned, which is CAL, which is actually Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o is also the patron of CAL. We were very much keen and very much disturbed by the fact that when we are in the diaspora, especially here in the German context, the first thing that we are told is don't speak your own mother tongue. If you have children and you bring them to school, and you come from the continent, most of the times they will tell you don't speak to this child in your own mother tongue. This child has to speak German. Otherwise, if you speak to this child in another language, then they will not understand the German language. But then if you are a couple, one is German, one is French, you're actually encouraged to speak two languages to these children. So this is how we came about, and actually acknowledging and understanding that our languages are very important, and that we have to learn them from small. So like I am teaching my own kids how to speak Kikuyu. I don't speak Kikuyu. I'm learning Kikuyu. With Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who only speaks to me in Kikuyu and writes in Kikuyu. And so now my work has been really translating what he says in Kikuyu into English and into German so that I can understand what he's saying. But you understand where I'm coming from. So my work has a lot to do with intersectionality, but also the institution of how we think about, translation and intersectionality. And I mean, it's clear from the room. We are talking about African literature. Look around you from a critical point of view. How many of us do you see? Who are the people who are doing the translation, especially in the German context? What does that mean from an institution point of view? Who are the people that can be seen, that cannot be seen? who are the people that have the opportunity to even have resources or not have resources. And so I think when you're speaking about translation, especially from a German perspective, we still have to think about the question of whiteness, the question of people who are at the forefront of actually doing African literature. And in German context, and I don't want to offend anybody, I think it's also important we also realize that the key voices in African literature in Germany are white Germans. Stimme Afrika, a super important literature house, but at the same time, at the beginning, it was very white. People who also, again, are speaking about African literature even within the universities are not people who look like me. I actually wanted to study English, and I had to drop it out, because when we read the book of Chinua Achebe, one professor interpreted it so wrongly that I had to leave the class, and I thought, this has got nothing to do with me. What he's talking about has got nothing to do with, with my culture or what I understand of a Nigerian culture. So for me, it's everything. I deal with it every day. And we can look at it, of course, from a very critical point of view of how translation is becoming more white. And then we also have to ask ourselves, what's the position of Black translators, maybe the work that you're doing, but also where are the Black voices within this translational field or translation field?
Thank you.
Okay.
Anything to add to that?
Yes. Thank you all for being here today. I think there's so many points that Njeri started on that I want to continue with. I think the first one being to maybe speak a little bit about what intersectionality is. And the reason I think this is important is because the term has gained a lot of popularity in the last years, also in the German context. And in positive ways, it's been used, right, as a lens to really think critically about how discrimination works in our society and change those realities for people who experience discrimination. But what's also happened is that the term has sort of been emptied of its meaning in many ways, right? And that its origins, which lie in critical race theory and Black feminist scholarship, have sort of been erased. And I think one of the things that I learned when I was organizing in many Black organizing spaces is that we talk about a term, even if everybody knows it already, because it's an important practice, because we are aware that we live in a world where sometimes our voices are being made invisible or are cast aside. So I'll do that now. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a legal scholar in the US in the late 80s. And it's a term that emerged out of a legal community of people, a very small legal community, who wanted to understand US law better and realized that there was sort of an assumption about law in general, but this, and specifically US law, that discrimination doesn't play a role, that it's a neutral, it's a neutral way of understanding and organizing society. And so her work was about looking at the different experiences of people, and specifically when experiences overlap or intersect, as she calls it. So her example is that, we talked a lot there was a conversation about race, for example, but often that conversation focused on Black males. So how did Black men experience racism? And then we had a conversation about gender, and that focused on the experiences of white women. And there was sort of this assumption that it's just the collusion of those two experiences that is the experience of Black women, when in fact what intersectionality argues is that there's a new reality that is created right out of the intersection of two identities, marginalized identities. And in that new reality, there's a whole new set of experiences, there's a whole new set of experience of discrimination, but also experiences of understanding and seeing the world. So, and I think it's important to honor sort of where this term comes from and what it actually means, because sometimes it's being used as, it just means a lot of different voices are allowed into a space of voices that might have been marginalized or might have not been marginalized. when in fact it's about making visible, right? Experiences that are often invisible. And so I see that as a very important practice in my work as well. And I would describe that in my work to be on two levels. So one is the actual practice of translation. So what does it mean to think about translating a text from an intersectional perspective? And I think what Njeri talked about with African languages is also true for African diasporic peoples and their experiences and their writing. So when I think about, you know, the texts of African American writers specifically, because this is my focus of study, historically they've been translated in Germany and by white translators who had very little understanding of African American history, of African American politics and sociology. And this is very evident in the translation of the text. Which is also a reason why I was very excited, together with Simoné and Miriam Nuning, to translate from a critical perspective Angela Davis' autobiography, which is such a groundbreaking text, right? And it speaks to so many communities in the world. And so what I think what that means is to give the same sort of value that we give to white authors and their translation, right? If you think about a translation of James Joyce's work, for example, another prominent white American author, same as, you know, compared to Toni Morrison, for example, who's a very prominent African American author, you see a very different kind of approach to the work, right? And it requires for someone to translate James Joyce to have knowledge about how James Joyce writes, about his style of writing, about the themes that he discusses in his work. But oftentimes, including with Toni Morrison historically in Germany, this was not something that was a prerequisite to translate her work, even though it's very detailed and it requires a lot of information and knowledge, right, about the experiences of the characters in that text. So this is a little bit about, you know, to give you an example of why I think intersectional translation is so important, and understanding really the role of power, right? I think this is what essentially we're talking about when we talk about intersectionality, is how does power play a role in our world in large? Yesterday we talked about on a panel about the relationship between translation and life, right? So if in life, in our society, we have power dynamics, and some people have more access to power and some less, then that is also reality in writing, and the things we write about, but also the perspectives of the writers and their positionality in the society. And so then that also means that for translators, this is imperative to understand this. And I think that's been often neglected, to understanding what is the role of power. And if we think about that critically, then the next question would be, who's translating the work of these authors, right? What is their positionality? What is within a society? What sort of information and knowledge do they bring to the text? And maybe how have they been socialized also about a particular group, right? So living in a society that is unequal, we're all being socialized every day about who has more worth in our society and who has less worth. And of course that has an impact on the way we translate. So part of my work is to really think critically about who's translating, right? And with what lens is this person translating, how this person's socialized. And this means also for me to critically think about my own lenses, right? How have I been socialized in particular spaces? So I'm Afro-German. I grew up in West Berlin, and then later Berlin. And so there's a set of lenses that I have, right, that I bring to the table. And my backgrounds, my roots lie in the United States, but then also in West Africa. And yeah, so this is an important aspect, I think, to think about the question of who's translating. And yeah, lastly, I think I would say to sort of focus a little bit beyond the translator itself, but thinking about the publishing industry at large, right? Who's making decisions about what texts are being translated? Who's being asked to translate certain texts? I think it's not easy for many of us to translate from a critical perspective, because there's still not a lot of awareness about what that means and that it's really important. So I'll end there.
Yeah, we'll still get back to that issue. We'll still get back to the issue of publishing. Who gets to determine who publishes or who translates and publishes what a text from an African author. Yeah. Before we round up.
Yes, I think I approach things from, well, 3 perspectives really. As a writer, and then in a previous life I used to be an academic. So I have a PhD in linguistics. And linguistics is particularly white and hierarchical in many ways, from my experience, my personal experience at university. And I think that intersectionality is often viewed as a hindrance to scientific progress in linguistics in particular, just from my personal experiences and the institutes I used to work at. So as a writer, I'm South African. I come from a community, South African and German. So in South Africa, I come from a community where we have actually lost our languages. So it is the one community that has been mixed race for many generations. We now try and call ourselves Kamisa people. For the longest time, there was a different way of naming us. And it's always been the case that we've been in the in-between, so stuck between cultures and languages, and that's very, very typical for all of the experiences of the people there. So then when I went to write about my experiences, oftentimes I was told, well, you're not really writing for a white audience. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm writing for exactly these people, and these people in South Africa and the South African people at large who will understand all of the differences that exist within there. But I think that also then manifests in translation when we look at the publishing industry as to who gets to translate what. And as a translator, I try and really look at the voice of whom I'm translating and try and do as much research as possible if I am not from the same cultural background before I start translating. But I think it's a really big problem in general that we have, that a lot of the translations at the moment still of works by people of color, black people, are still being translated by white people and being translated rather uncritically. And of course, as a translator, you're also a writer. So you also write your own perspective into your work. And what that does is it changes the perspective and makes it more, it makes it easier to understand, maybe more palatable for a white audience. And so those are the things that I think about when I think about intersectional approaches in writing and in translating and in academia at large. Yeah. Okay,
thank you very much. Since you've actually moved on to the issue of who gets to translate works from African authors, I'd like to say a few things and also let you talk a bit about it before I ask you your opinion about all this. So, yes, so who gets to translate these books and books from African authors, and who gets to decide who is famous enough to be, whose work is famous enough to be, to actually deserve to be translated into German? The only book that, it's actually, there's an issue with translating, since we're talking about African languages here. It's always been quite difficult getting a publishing house to actually consider the prospect of getting a book translated directly from an African language into German. So the only book that I can remember that a lot of work was put into it many years ago was the Tanzanian author, and the late Aniceto Teresa's Kinder der Regenmacher, which sold thousands and thousands of copies. And that was a collective project at that time. And but afterwards, there hasn't been anything of that magnitude that has actually, none that I know of, and I know that I've kept an eye of on the publishing industry here for a while. So I know that nothing of that magnitude has taken place since then. So the question is why? So based on your own experiences with translation, in Germany, for example, into German, what have been the challenges that you've actually had to navigate or go through?
So,
Melody.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. I can't speak to translating out of African languages because I translate from German into English. So my focus is more translating the works by Afro-diasporic people, right, who write in English or German. So, I think there's a lot of work being done to translate into German, or the other way around, to translate work by German authors into other languages, right? There's many institutions that are interested in having German literature be available and be disseminated throughout the world. And I think for me then the question is, what is German literature, right? Who belongs in that description? And I think historically, and perhaps presently as well, when I look at a number of institutions and the way they describe German literature, right? It is, it's very exclusive. There's only a few, certain kinds of people that belong to that community. And Afro-Germans, for example, we have a literary canon, and our work is not being translated at the rate at white German translators' work is translated, and oftentimes, just like in society at large, we are not even considered to be part of this society, right? And I think even the conversation about having African literature translated, which I think is key and is important, has to always involve also the question of who are Africans in Germany and their diaspora, right? And so, so I think this is for me one of the challenges that I see is about making visible a more diverse set of German literature, right? And this also is, includes literature by women, queer literature. I mean, it's so many groups, I think, that are not represented adequately in that. And and so this is into German, or into German, the text. But I think translating into English to make visible also that community that I describe is also very important. So, and I think it's only been done in limited ways. So I think the reason is because we don't have representation at the key spaces, right, where the decisions are being made at the end of the day. And that includes what text is being translated, who translates that text, but also this question that Simoné raised about audience, right, I think is also really crucial to think about. Like, if we imagine Germany and if we imagine German literature as a much more diverse place, then we also think about what needs to be translated for who, right? And also the way that we translate, we imagine differently, because now we think of a Black audience, a queer audience, an audience of women, a feminist audience, for example. And so when we did, just to give an example, the autobiography of Angela Davis, Eine Autobiografie, there were many points in my process where I thought about who is the audience here, right? And so to just give you a small example that might sound trivial, is there's a scene where Angela Davis describes her childhood, and she talks about visiting her grandparents in the countryside, and she talks about the food that her grandparents prepared, right? And the food is, in our tradition, is called soul food. And there's many different dishes that we prepare, and one of the dishes is collard greens. So it's a vegetable that is cooked in a particular way. And so I was wrestling with myself, what kind of translations do I choose for, particularly for food, right? Because it's so personal, it's so much part of our identity, it says so much about who we are as a people. Someone suggested that I choose grünkohl, which I thought, I don't think that's a good idea. And the reason is not because I hate grünkohl, but it's because I was thinking about how can someone, who's going to relate to what this is, right? Because collard greens, of course, when we think about food history, we find similar vegetables in different African contexts and in West Indian contexts. Callaloo, for example, I always call the cousin of collard greens. And you can only recognize that if you know the actual name of the dish, right? So there's something lost in me translating it into a German word that doesn't describe it, but is really only done so that a German audience, that it's imagined as knowing only something inside of their own space, right, can understand it better. For me, that's too limiting. I want it to be accessible to a wide range of people. And so I have to think about how can this translation connects to people? How do people identify what it actually was, right? Where does it come from? So this is one example of the challenge of, right?
Because when you translate works like that, you translate culture as well, and you translate traditions, and that is what intersectionality is all about, and they're all interconnected, and they work together. So you can't do one and leave the other. Right. Your translation will be incomplete. Yeah. And those are the challenges that you have when you're translating books like that.
Yeah. What was the solution? The solution was to leave it as it is, right?
That was what I was going to suggest.
Yeah, and the challenge, though, is that a publisher, and not in this case, but oftentimes in my experience, the publisher says then, zu viele Anglizismen, this has to go, right? This has to be grünkohl. And that is, to me, it's, so it means we have to, it means about, it means so many things. It means also like, how do we think about German language then in the future, and how do we think about it in translation? But
no, in such a case like that, you put your foot down and say, well, this is how it has to be.
Yeah, it was really interesting in general because we were
that happened.
Translating in community a lot of the time. So we all had these issues with certain terms that we had to discuss in detail, and I learned a lot from that process actually. And I need you to translate my book. I was just going to say, you're the person that I would ask. But to come back to your question, I think one of the key issues as to why or there's only a very limited number of texts that get translated from African languages or from Afro-diasporic authors in general is that tokenism plays a huge role in the publishing industry. So if you have one person from one culture, oftentimes that's viewed as enough, right? So, and that has been a problem for me as well. Just people saying, well, we already have one South African author, and that's enough for our program. We've covered all of South Africa with that.
Maybe I can add to that. I think for me, so I'm not a translator, I'm a historian, so I'm trying to think this from a historical point of view. history. I think in the German context is really this problem of who is an expert, who is considered an expert. And a lot of times, even if we are the ones speaking the languages and we know the know-how and we have the tools and the strategies, most of the times you're not considered the experts who can be able to do the translation. Mm-hmm. So a lot of publishing houses would rather have someone who studied maybe the African language 3, 4, 5 years, went and did an internship in Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, or anywhere in the continent. Then they come back, and then they become the experts, because then they are considered to be the ones who are more, and again, in the German context, wissenschaftlich. So again, this becomes a huge problem, because this is also a way of limiting black translators into the German translating world. So I'm speaking very much from an institutional point of view, because I come from an institution. And so if we are going to think about the institution, we first of all have to decolonize. And I'm not meaning decolonize the way now we're using it as if you're drinking water, but really decolonizing, thinking about that institution of translating. So I think the critical question is who is doing the translating, because translating is also, for me, a political act. You're giving a voice to a certain group of people. You're bringing the culture into that translating field. You're also producing knowledge, not only consuming, but you also produce something. So, and I think in the German context, because I don't know what happens outside, out of Germany, I mean, I do a little bit, but not so much. In the German context, we still have this huge problem of you're an expert, you're not an expert. If you come from Kenya and you speak Swahili, the chances of an African institute giving you a working position to teach Kiswahili is almost zero. Yeah? But in African studies, most of the time. Who are the professors who are in German, who are in African studies, who are teaching African literature, who are teaching African languages, but who are also translating, right? So you can see there are three levels of how this is being kept white in terms of how this thing is being safeguarded by who is included, who is not included. And I think tokenism also plays a major role, but it also plays a major role because some, when they enter into the field, because they are the only ones, and I think this is why acknowledging is very important, to acknowledge that you are not the first, but that there have been people there before, then you also turn into a gatekeeper. Right? So you don't include other black translators. You don't include other translators of color, because it's about the resources. It's about who can be seen, who cannot be seen. It's about who is more visible and who is not more visible, right? And so there's a new word that I learned, being seduced by whiteness. So you think the more, the more you're out there, the more white publishers, include you, the more white publishers write your name there, then you have this feeling of, oh, I made it, I am here, I am better now than Njeri because now I'm the forefront. But then you forget, through this journey, you lose so much, right? Because with this translation, you're also either removing something from the whole, or you're adding something to it, or you're actually destroying a whole culture of people. So I'll just give a short example. In my university, we discovered something which had been written by a Kenyan professor, actually. And he wrote his work about the colonial history of his people in Latin. So are there any black translators who know Latin? That would be a very good thing, because it's very important, because he's writing about the colonial history of his people, and he coded that language, and he coded that knowledge in Latin. And now we are in the process of translating the work from Latin to German. And we want to translate from German to English, there you come, and from English to his own mother tongue, because it's important that also this work, this knowledge that was, in the cellar, in the basement of the University of Cologne since 1969. So he wrote the work in 1969. 1969, University of Cologne was white, whiter, and whitest. So I can imagine that he was the only black student at that university in 1969. And so you can imagine all that knowledge that has been kept into the basement of the university. So when this work is translated, I was asking myself, what is going to be lost in that translating, but also what is going to be new? But also, how is that going to be also a way of how he archived knowledge of his own people, but also a new form of knowledge production in terms of the discourse of decolonizing the university. So I think from a very critical point of view, as a historian.
We've learned a lot from that, actually, because it's very important. What you just talked about also this lack of space for people of color to actually also translate works from African authors and other and Black authors as a whole into German. Mm-hmm. Yes, this space has been this has been an issue that has just been that we've been trying to deal with for quite a long time. But it's like, well, there are no experts in this field, because no publisher will trust a Black person to actually be able to translate correctly into German. You understand? So as a result of this, that space has just never really been made for people of color to actually also be part of the group of people that translate works from African Black authors into German. So, would you like to add something?
Well, I'm so fascinated by what I'm hearing. I've been around Europe for a while and around this translation question, and it's similar in the different societies that Black study, white African studies has generally been taught by European or white people. And even when we've existed either as people who can feed direct knowledge because we speak our languages, there is no space for you unless, I can give you my example. I wanted to study, I translated Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, so I wanted to study and become an academic in Kikuyu translation, for example. And I met somebody at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and the person who was going to supervise me specialized in a Southern African Bantu language. And I was like, I speak my mother tongue since I was born. I can come and study without being supervised by somebody who speaks a Zambian language or whatever, but that's who they had, a Bantu specialist. And my work is not about linguistics, and he may well be a specialist in Bantu linguistics, but my work is about translation. But beyond that, I had fallen upon translating Ngugi's book, which right from the beginning had asked the reader to read the book however they wanted to read the book. That's there's a foreword to the reader. And I was very nervous as a young person translating into English. What can I do? I was already a feminist, and I was thinking, okay, maybe I should take this seriously and translate this as a feminist translator. But the book itself did not lend itself to that. Although he had made that invitation, I still don't believe it was a genuine invitation. It's a very traditional text. And the first word of the book is in Kikuyu, the third person subject is neutral. Mtu, there's neither male, it's not gendered. So I was very excited. But the first word you come across in this ali, the person, but in English it's fixed. It has to be he or she. And it would have been very exciting if I had been very bold and, you know, and said she. But everything else that followed in the book was very clear that it was a male character. And I don't want to go into a deep conversation about transgender identity, which would have been available, but it was way before the conversations we're having now, which I hope I'm not about to open a Pandora's box here, but it's a very important question that we mustn't put under the carpet. And then there's a character who's a female prostitute, and at one point she sits on the lap of this clearly man who had a beard. And if I'd followed the logic of saying that the character was female, then it would have ended up in a queer kind of engagement. And I didn't think at that time that Ngugi was that far advanced in his thinking about gender. So I spared the character from being a female sitting on the lap of another. It's just to give you an example, and a serious example, that you're confronted with decision-making. And then would the publishers have tolerated this queer appearance of Ngugi's work? I'm still tempted now in the next reiteration that Ngugi, not because of this issue, he has said in his lifetime he wants this translation to remain as it is, and it is his work. I'm open to multiple translations of any work, because that's what the intersectional question invites, different readings. Also, as a scholar, I believe we read texts how we wish to read them. So readers are intelligent people. I still haven't managed to read Matigari as a queer text. Maybe in my next life, I'll not be so influenced by what has happened. And there are all those kinds of incidences. And then the publishers also have a market which may have a traditional, they want to see Ngugi as a kind of writer who writes in a certain way about African cultures. I don't think, we had to translate Binyavaga's story, which is a queer story, and we haven't published the book yet because it came out in Kiswahili, and there are terms about that are clear that it's a queer text, but it hasn't emerged in the world, partly because he died, and we translated it into Kikuyu, but it hasn't been published, partly because he died, and we haven't sorted out the rights yet, but we don't even know how it would be received in a Kikuyu queer text. You know, it would be, but the book itself, it's clearly a story, probably an autobiographical, maybe fiction, but it's clearly a queer male setup. But it did come out in Kiswahili, in that collection of romance stories, and it's in Kiswahili, and the translation is in Kiswahili. So that was quite a breakthrough in Africa, in at least East African literature. And there wasn't a big drama about it, but people probably haven't read it. But it was published by Cassava Republic. But more importantly for me, because in setting up this kind of panel, is to say that we don't even amongst ourselves have an understanding of what intersectional translate. We have a general picture that there are many exclusions, and that there's a whole plethora of able-bodiedness, you know, so many assumptions. When you say a person, or he, or she, it carries so many connotations. And then are you going to have a whole list of things? There's a black person, disabled, you know, when you see that word he, what kind of he person do you imagine? Because it's a character, and the author hasn't written down whether the person is blind. It may not be important to say that the person is blind, or tall, or short, or round, or, you know. So it opens up a conversation of how mainstream society thinks about itself. And mainstream society seems to be white, able-bodied, and for a long time has been male in the scholarship field. So it's for us to work together collectively as emerging translators and share how, and then most translations are done individually. So we don't have like a collective where we can say in Ngugi's book, I sat there stunned with this first word of the book. I was like, huh? He, What am I going to do? I sat for days, I couldn't translate. I said, okay, what? And then I also quarreled with the book because the Matigari means those who survived the bullets, meaning the people who'd been in Mau Mau. And I knew in my heart that Mau Mau there had been women, Mau Mau. And I knew in my heart that that person with the beard was not like the female Mau Mau people. And I thought, what a missed opportunity if I had made the character a she, but there were technical issues later, this sitting on the lap of a man. And it's not what I would have wanted to do with my Mau Mau woman, you know. So there were technical issues that barred me from having a feminist Matigari, but then it means that the text will be forever read that Matigari were men. And then again, it's erasing all these women freedom fighters, some like Mary Modoni Nyanjiro was only buried this year. And many people did, Field Marshal Modoni, they didn't know that they were even Field Marshal Mau Mau women, etc. So I could go on, but for me, it's to have institutions and to have collaborative work. If we know who's translating Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison across the world, black or white, to have collectives where we can debate these issues and look at how they fit into the cultures into which we're translating. But I also wanted to say I'm aware that Manfred is here, who's a publisher of African, Asian, and Caribbean books, and it would be good, since we are lucky to have him at this festival, if at some point he's able, when Q&A, just to say it would be good to hear, because we had a panel here earlier, and that single text issue is really, when one book is published, then we've published all of Africa for the next 15 years. And he did say in the earlier panel that all the writers disappeared, and then a new generation, which is really literally like my generation, we have hardly been published. After Achebe, people, boom, nothing, and then the next Chimamanda. So there's a whole empty space there. So those are some of the exclusions that I would have wanted also to explore.
No, because you talked about queerness in Gugi's Matigari, it just brought to my mind this issue of intersectionality, how far we can go with it, actually. Because when somebody wrote about Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart from the queer point of view, he was they almost ran him out of the city, because it was like, how could he even think, how could the author even think of writing about Things Fall Apart from that perspective? So in terms of trying to read a new, bring something new, look at it from a different perspective, it was impossible for the author to actually pull it through, because it's different from the image of a patriarchal society that measured everything based on how much power a man could wield in the society. So this also, it's similar to what you talked about. So how far can intersectionality actually work within the African perspective?
So I think that's a very important question, and one I was asking myself mostly while writing, really, because I was writing, as so often, about, it's an auto-fictional book to an extent, which is often what is expected of people with a post-migrant perspective in Germany. And I wanted to fictionalize more sometimes, but I was uncertain as to whether or not I could actually go that far, queer this character, make this character a woman, right? Because in a certain way, I'm also in a very privileged position of being able to talk about my this community which has not been talked about a lot for basically the first time in Germany. So this is the first vantage point in a lot of different ways for a German audience. And so that was a huge question for me. And when translating, that is also, it was also always a huge question or problem when we talked about, in this book in particular, when we talked about certain aspects that we would have to look at maybe from a modern perspective, and in the end we decided to keep the text as it was, because in the foreword, in the third foreword, Angela Davis herself writes, well, she wasn't looking at things from the point of view of queerness, for example, or she didn't include feminism quite as much as she would have liked in the text. And so we decided to keep it, but at times we had a lengthy discussion about one footnote, because Angela Davis spent some time in Germany, and she makes, there are a couple of statements about Eastern Germany in particular, one being that racism in Eastern Germany wasn't an issue, which, as we know, isn't the case, right? But is the narrative that was very common in Eastern Germany. And we didn't know how to quite go about it, so in the end we had a comment, but we didn't want to sort of interfere with the text too much. And so that was quite a lengthy discussion, one of our many fun discussions that we had. Yeah,
I think that's a great example, actually. Yeah, because I think in our case, we were very lucky, right? So we have a living author who republished her autobiography that she wrote for the first time in 1972, and it was republished in 88 and now published in 2021, and she wrote another foreword for it, right? So it's already her reflecting on her own work that was published many, many years ago. So we already had information, right, from her that we could use also in thinking about how do we translate certain aspects. Not everything, but some. And I think this is sometimes a critical conversation of, right, what do you let stand as it is, right? But I think the question of context also matters, right? So writers, of course, they write oftentimes in their own context. Their writing comes out of their own context. It doesn't mean that they're not familiar with other contexts, but now we're translating this person's work into a different context that has a different reality that reads differently also, right? And so I think in this case, it was very important for us because we know how violent that narrative is, that there was no racism in East Germany. I mean, people are still impacted in their daily lives by having to articulate and justify sort of that they had discriminatory experiences. And I mean, I'm not singling out East Germany. This was just the particular case. This is also a case in West Germany. But at the same time, honor the text, right? And the text speaks for itself. But I think what led us at the end to contextualize, that particular statement is because Angela Davis reflected herself and her own perspective, I think, really, which is to critically think about her work and everybody's work constantly, right? It's not a thing that you just do one time and you write something, but it's a continual process that's evolving also. And I think it was very beautiful for us it was a beautiful gift for us to have those reflections, right, of her reflecting on her own work and the things that she would have maybe described differently. Would she be writing the work new again now, which was not part of the project, right? And so that's why she wrote the introduction, I think, to talk a little bit about her perspective of contemporary society and movements and how things have changed. So, yeah.
Yes, definitely. And one more thing I would like to add is that I would be very interested in having work translated into African languages, isiZulu, for example. But that's something I would have to advocate for with my publishing.
Okay. Yeah. So before we open up this discussion and bring in the audience. I just want to add briefly that I wrote a book. Well, my thesis, my doctoral thesis was called Translating and Publishing African Literatures and Languages, examples from Nigeria, Ghana, and Germany. So what I did as a result of that was that afterwards, for more than 20 years at least, until before the COVID started, well, while COVID started. So I would go to the Frankfurt Book Fair. So I was like a scout who was just going around all the publishing houses to see who was publishing works, works from African authors, either translating them into German. So what I observed during that time was that there were just a few of them. And oftentimes it would be like when Chinua Achebe got the Liberator Prize, all of a sudden Rahab brought out everything that he had written, that they had published in the past. They quickly brought, republished them and put them out there looking very good. But those were just flashes of what was going on at that time. So even when we're talking about translation today, there are just quite a few opportunities actually to even break through into the market. So I hope I'm wrong on this, but.
Can I add something to that, just quick?
Yeah.
Because I also think you also need to ask ourselves the issue of ownership, right? In terms of when an African author becomes so famous, there's a kind of ownership that comes from the people who are translating. So that's why you have a few selected who get translated and the rest not, because they have already made it. So you're not just translating a text from Njeri, who is unknown, but you're translating text of Chimamanda, of Chinua Achebe, of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, but you're not translating texts that maybe have been written by the Mau Mau women, right? You're not translating texts that have been written by women or by men who are in the continent. So there's also a kind of a class issue also when it comes to translating and also of owning, right? Like then the white publishers own the work, or they own our African authors, right? Like if I contacted an African author, if I didn't know them, they would not respond. But if I was Sebastian Smith and said, it means Sebastian Müller, I'm coming from this and this place, probably they will answer, because it's also a class thing that is going on.
Okay. I hope we're wrong on that. Okay, so please, questions? The floor is open for questions.
Okay. So I'm deeply touched by what you raised on the South African context, right? Is that when we look at children's literature, for example, and there's one who's more established and published, it's that whenever now there needs to be a growth in children's literature, it will be no, but so-and-so has already done it, not giving space for more representation. I think one of the things that I've said even to Prof is that our legendary storyteller in South Africa has given more space, because she's even created a directory of storytellers to create a children's literature and stories that represent us well. But also, I want to touch on that of the fact that who publishes it, right? And one of my colleagues in the storytelling field was saying that there was a point that she went to UNISA, right? And she picked this book up. The surname was not its one surname, so I'm not going to say much about that. But the title was Setswana for Beginners, but you don't even know Setswana, and you are telling me about my language. Like, it's weird, because there's no consultation or involvement of people who speak, who sleep, who eat that language, because they don't have the resources maybe to publish. They either from the rural areas, and if it's from the rural areas, we want to change it in a context that suits us because we've got the resources, want it to look, want to polish it. Yeah, that's my.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
We were also speaking earlier today about earlier works by Africans, where there would be an African informant, and then they would give the story to a white person who would then publish the work in their name, and they would never acknowledge that somebody who spoke the language was actually the translator. So there are many stories, African collection of African stories that exist, but we don't know who told them to that white person. Yeah. And as you know, in the storytelling tradition, one, those people were never paid. Two, we'll never know who they are. And that still goes on today, especially in scholarship. Where people, we were talking about earlier, that all the scholars, you can't go to Kenya in 5 minutes and you don't speak Kikuyu or Zulu or whatever, and come back and do a PhD compared to somebody who's grown up with the language. And even that is not sufficient. You need to learn the language. And as we were saying here, many of us have not learned these languages. And the first night that we performed here, none of us had formally studied African languages. So as well as having networks of translators of a specific language, like I've been alone for a long time, but I meet now people who are working in Kikuyu, like Jega Gidiora, and we can have real proper conversations about orthography, which doesn't even exist in many African languages. So we're really quite up, and you saw with the passing away of this language, which if Uma Katrina had not been there trying to rescue it, many of our languages are actually endangered. Because we are my mother is a bilingual speaker. My grandmother was a bilingual speaker. So the monolingual generation died a long time ago, and definitely my son hardly speaks Kikuyu. So I'm, in my family, the last speaker of Kikuyu. If other Kikuyu people, my generation, don't get together, and the Luo people, and the Kamba people, and the Zulu people. So we are at an endangered moment of these, and then we are not translating. It's one rare Ngugi wa Thiong'o who will write a book in Kikuyu, and then what? And I tell people this, and they're very shocked. The corpus of Kikuyu literature is less than 30 books. Just that one language, and I'm sure in another language it's 2 books. So we are in an endangered moment, and conferences and meetings like this are so important, because when we lose our languages, as we've seen with a new language, which is the ancient language of humanity, it's part of the San language, we lose all the knowledge, the indigenous knowledges that it carries, and the world's medicines, the world's food systems, are usually embedded in these indigenous, although not written, they are there as custodians and libraries of our lives. So then when we lose out the dictionary of intersectionality, and we only have a white man's view to African issues, even the PhD in Latin somewhere, and it's a lot of it. And I, on top, because of my translation work, I also do knowledge management work, which came out of this. Then I discovered that knowledge management is lost in translation because it's in the vaults of Western institutions, mainly. And then it's not digitalized even when it's in Africa. And even the African researchers in African universities, it's all in European languages. And they are not even digitalized, they're not in libraries, they're just tearing away with termites and things. So we are, as we live losing even our current archive to the European languages and to termites. So institutionalizing the preservation of languages is not just about us moving them with intersectionality, it's also preserving. And in those fragments, we may find intersectional answers that we don't know about because we haven't read them. But we need people to learn the languages. We need painstaking individuals who will give up their lives and say, I'm a translator. And most of us are doubling up as teachers, institution makers, policy makers, curators. So it's a whole big world. But sorry, I apologize.
Sorry, I think you have 5 seconds to respond to this. Hi, sorry, here. Sorry. You have 5 seconds to respond to this. So just on the idea of reading differently, you said that Aniseti Teresa from Tanzania was translated here, and the reading was worth sort of like it was very, very huge. So I've been published by the same translator, the same publisher as Aniseti, and he's not read at all in Tanzania. Actually, his books are just gathering dust. What happened there?
Yeah, if I can remember clearly, at that time, I think the publisher, Hermann Schulze, who actually, and I think he grew up in Tanzania as well, did precisely that was what he did. He organized the project, and that book itself was translated into German. And it was made popular here, but apparently not in Tanzania.
So again,
you understand? And I know that he had some other manuscripts as well that could be translated. So what I personally did at that particular time was to talk to Professor Ali Mazrui about it, and he actually was ready to finance it. So I also got in touch with Hermann Schulze and also with Peter Ripken, and we tried to get Aniseti's nephew, who had the rights to his manuscripts, to what was still left of his manuscripts. But we searched for him for years. But we couldn't find him, and that was how we left it. I think that is my own experience with what you're talking about. So why nothing has been done since then? Well, I can only say, well, there are many reasons behind it. Yes? Yes, yes.
I'm very sorry, but we have to continue this conversation, unfortunately, off the stage, because the other guests who will present the next panel are already waiting. So okay. I'm very sorry, but I mean, please stay. It's a fascinating conversation.
Oh, sorry, just 1 minute, could we?
Yes, of course.
Give that person just one.
Okay, but we.
Just very,
okay,
just very
okay. And I don't want to stop the conversation. Yes, please continue.
Yes.
We just need
just very briefly, and then we can round up. Because we thought we had to.
Thank you very much. I'll make it very, very brief. I'll make it very brief.
Yeah.
My name is Kadara Swaleh, anthropology student from Kenya, who is based here at FO. Looking at translation, Swahili translation, I would like to share a small anecdote here, which might help us. The first thing to be translated into Kiswahili in East Africa was a Swahili dictionary by the Missionary Society of Africa or East Africa.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Secondly, they translated the first Bible into Kiswahili. The same missionary society, they translated the first Quran copy from Arabic to Kiswahili. This brought politics. Muslims were not happy. They also translated their own. a lot of Arabic connotation of the language was removed. So is this part of transsectionality? Thank you.
Can I say something to that? Because I was thinking earlier already when Wangũi was speaking that I think part of intersectional translation is a critical analysis also of the context in which translation moves and emerges, right? It's impossible to think about translation divorced from its context, in its historical context as well as present context. So how to preserve, you know, or how did it, when we listened to Mama Uma Catarina yesterday, and she was talking about apartheid and how it came to this current situation of her fighting for her language, right? It's imperative that we know the context. It's not just about transcribing the language or archiving it, but understanding the context so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, it's very important. So on this note, I say thank you very much to everyone that is on this panel today. We have been enriched by the knowledge that you have shared with each and every one of us. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.